it isn't that we go into a recession when there's not a lot of people out there in the workforce. No, we go into a recession when we've overhired because there's too much stimulus, and then we go into a recession. And once that recession of negative growth starts, then we start shedding jobs. So when Janet Yellen and President Biden came out and said, oh, we can't go into a recession, we're at too low of unemployment, that's the very time that every recession previously has happened, is when unemployment is at its lowest, because then the economy doesn't need to be buying all these goods. Then it comes to shedding those jobs. And then that's when people start getting laid off. Then they come out and they're like, well, now we're in a real recession.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Our Watch. I am Tim Thompson, and I am glad to have you on the program today. We are joined today with Brian Decker. Brian, glad to have you on the program.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Tim.
Yeah, we've had you before. I'm very grateful to have you a part of what we're doing. Love your insight into what's going on financially with the world. There's a lot going on right now. We've been changing definitions across the board on everything in our culture. Now our president is trying to change the definition of recession. And so I want to ask you, what say you? Are we in a recession? Are we headed towards one? What's going on?
Yeah, so we absolutely are in a recession. Now, one of the things that people have to understand is there's an actual government entity, and that's called the NBER, that they basically put in place that basically measures certain economic facts. And they basically call the game once not only that the game has been over, but we've had, it'd be like if we play the Super Bowl is always on a Sunday, right? Well, imagine if the end of the Super Bowl is on Sunday and they sat on the score, and then we had ESPN the following Sunday say, okay, the final Super Bowl score is X, Y, and Z. The world already knew what the score was. Why are we waiting a week? And that's exactly what the federal government does with the recession, that they wait to call it until it's such common sense that they really have a discredit for the average American's intelligence, right? And so a recession is kind of, defined a couple different ways. So the main way that the stock market always has used a recession is 2 quarters of negative growth with GDP. So in layman's terms, let's say for an example, so let's say we take a company and we're going to choose Walmart as a company, right? And let's say that Walmart does sales in the 4th quarter of 2021 of $100 million, right? And then in the 1st quarter of 2022, they do 100, instead of 100 million, they do 90 million, okay? So it's declined by 10%. Now, Walmart still had sales. They didn't go out of business, but their sales are declining. And then they do the 2nd quarter of 2022, and Walmart reports now it's 85 million in sales. So we had 100 million, then we went to 90 million, then we went to 85 million. So we've had 2 quarters, or roughly 6 months of time, where the company declined in its sales. And that's exactly what GDP is. GDP is basically the country's revenue that's being brought in, right? From not only consumer activities, but also exporting and all manufacturing and all those things. Well, we just had the end of the 2nd quarter of 2022 just finished. And so the Atlanta Fed, which is kind of the outlier, they're the ones I actually really like because they call it the truth of it. They came out and said, hey, we had negative growth in the 1st quarter and we had negative growth in the 2nd quarter, but we can't call the game yet. We need to revise our numbers a couple more times, reach agreement with the other Fed offices, and then we're going to supply this information to the NBER, and then they're going to come out pretty much 90 days after the quarter ended and then say, hey, we're in a recession. Right?
Yeah. So I do some math. You say 90 days after that, that puts us into August, September, October, just before the general election.
Yep.
The midterms.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's what they're going to do. And I think that's why we had President Biden come out and he's trying to redefine this definition of a recession. And I think one of the things that really, when I try to be, very respectful of everybody, but there's just some things that when they're said, that if you don't stand up and provide a level of truth, like it should eat at your core as a human being, right? And so when President Biden came out there and says, I don't see how a recession would happen. And then Janet Yellen comes out and says, oh, there's no way we're going to have a recession with employment rate this high. We have such low unemployment. And it's laughable because every single recession does not begin when unemployment is high. What actually happens is a recession begins when unemployment is at its lowest. For the reason, what did we just go through? We went through a period of time where we kind of entered in a recession with COVID. And then we had all this stimulus get thrown on us that everybody was buying second homes and RVs and cars. And why? Because we had the federal government come out and said, hey, I don't care if you lost your job or didn't lose your job. All you got to do is call your mortgage company and say, hey, I'm going through a little bit of a hard time. And they're going to say, hey, don't worry about making your mortgage payments for 12 months, 18 months, or 24 months. So truthfully, the average American, if you give them an opportunity to not make their most expensive payment every month, and you tell them that, hey, we're just going to throw it on to the back end of your loan, do you think those people are going to go out there and say, no, my job's okay. I don't need to do this? No. What are they going to do? They're going to be like, oh my gosh, I have an extra $3,000 a month. Well, I could probably use some new things on Amazon. We've always wanted that new boat. We've always wanted that new RV. Interest rates are so low. We just got a big PPP check. Might as well go out and spend that too, right?
So we don't have to pay that back.
We don't have to pay that back.
Right.
In our economy in the U.S., we are not like, so my grandpa and my great-grandfather, they were the great generation of America, right? They grew up on back-to-back world wars. We took over the world as a powerhouse of building, cars, building airplanes. We had Boeing, we had Ford, we had General Motors, right? And we had all these things. But what we do is we kind of got lazy as a generation, kind of from the baby boomers and then to, Gen X and now millennials and all these things. And so what we've had happen is we've outsourced all the things that we consume, and rather being a producer of goods in America, we're a consumer of goods. And so our economy now, we are built, 70% of all the revenue we generate as a country is from us buying goods from other people and spending it at retailers. So what happens to an economy when you give everybody all this free money and you send them out there to buy goods? What happens? Everybody's got to hire more people. Oh, I got to hire more people to work the car dealerships. I got to hire more contractors to build these things. So we hired all of these people at all these employers, which what does it do? Drops employment. Way. Unemployment rate then goes down to 3%. Well, what happens when the free stimulus stops and everyone can't keep spending at these amounts? Well, we're like, oh, shoot, as an employer, well, I guess I don't need all the extra 30% of employees I hired when all this free money came out. Well, people aren't buying as many cars, probably don't need as many people for that. So what then you happen is you see a slowdown in consumer spending. Well, we have to notice that slowdown. And then what do companies do? They say, I probably shouldn't hire a bunch of people. I'm going to start with a hiring freeze. It's what Apple just did, okay? We say, no more, I'm not going to hire anybody. First time Apple's ever done that in the history of Apple, okay? Hiring freeze. Then they get their numbers, which Apple's going to report their numbers this week. And if they're not doing very well, then they come out and they start laying people off. Well, it isn't that we go into a recession when there's not a lot of people out there in the workforce. No, we go into a recession when we've overhired because there's too much stimulus, and then we go into a recession. And once that recession of negative growth starts, then we start shedding jobs. So when Janet Yellen and President Biden came out and said, oh, we can't go into a recession, we're at too low of unemployment, that's the very time that every recession previously has happened, is when unemployment is at its lowest, because then the economy doesn't need to be buying all these goods. Then it comes to shedding those jobs. And then that's when people start getting laid off. Then they come out and they're like, well, now we're in a real recession.
Yeah. And so, I mean, like you said, the average American can see we're in a recession. We see all the signs of it, and we're starting to see that affect many areas of our lives. Homeowners or prospective homeowners, people who are trying to sell their homes. The real estate market is definitely taking a shift right now. Tell us what you're seeing as far as the real estate market.
Absolutely. And so, my background, I've been in the mortgage and real estate industry. I owned a mortgage bank for the last 19 years. I own a lot of rental properties. And so we lend in about 9 different states. So I've seen pretty much a good mixture of everything from the hot Florida markets to the California markets to Arizona to Tennessee to more stable markets like Virginia and Ohio. And here's what we're basically seeing is we got to a period of time that when the Federal Reserve came out and said, hey, we are going to start buying as many mortgage loans as possible. So let's say that, there's 10 of us in a room and we have a bank come in like Bank of America, and they come into this meeting and they say, hey, anybody want to buy 30-year fixed mortgages at 3%? Every pension fund, teacher's fund is like, inflation's like 6%. Why would I ever want to lock up my money for 30 years at 3% interest? No, I'm good. Well, then we got the idiot in the room known as the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, and they're like, I'll buy them. I'll buy those loans at 3%. Shoot, I'll buy them at 2.5%. So what ends up happening is mortgage interest rates plummeted because the federal government was basically subsidizing these low mortgage rates. So then you had the average American who made $60,000 who would never have been able to qualify for a mortgage more than $250,000 or $300,000. But then rates go down to 2% and they're like, I can buy a $500,000 house because my mortgage payment is the same as what my mortgage payment would be on a $300,000 house. Okay, you sure I can qualify for that? Yeah, here's your payment. Yeah, good. Okay, I can afford that. And so you had all these people out there with these low mortgage rates because people in America, we buy a good not based on the cost of that, like our grandparents. We buy a good based on what that monthly payment's going to be. So we had for 2 years these extremely low mortgage rates, causing the average home in America, the median house price across the country, to go from $270,000 at the beginning of the pandemic to reaching an all-time high in June of $430,000. They literally went up almost 70% in 2 years. And then what we saw the Fed do is once they started realizing inflation's getting a little too hot, no longer did they decide to be the idiot in the room. They're like, they didn't even show up to the room anymore. They made an announcement in November and said, we're not going to those auctions. And then what was left is all the sane money, these pension funds and hedge funds that are like, I'm not lending rates at 3%. Right. Like, no way. Like, inflation's 9%. Then we saw mortgage rates double in 3 months. The average mortgage payment in America that was only $1,100 a month, which I know for us in California, that seems unrealistic, but we have to remember we're an expensive market, right? $1,100 a month went up to $2,100 a month in 6 months. They almost doubled, which then as soon as you feel that, those average person whose income doubled in the last 2 years, not the average Americans, right? They have less buying power. So what we saw is just this break get pulled. And all of a sudden, we've seen in the last 90 days, buyer traffic through open houses dropped by 70% from the beginning of the year. Pending home sales right now are at their lowest levels since 2008, okay? Meaning the amount of homes that are going to be closing this month. And we have seen inventory across the United States just since the beginning of the year go up 75% in the beginning of the year. So most people are like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. No. When you have this unrealistic growth of home prices, you have to cool it off. What goes up super fast has to come down super fast. And so kind of giving the average person an outlook, if you are wanting to be into the market to buy a home, note that you now, the buyer, you are in control. So if you see a property that you're like, hey, I really need to buy this home, my rent keeps going up, you could probably get that home. If I was going to be a betting man from right now to the end of the year, you'd probably get a 10% discount on average off that home. And the good thing is don't be alarmed, everybody. Mortgage rates obviously aren't going to stay elevated because, as you pointed out, we got midterms coming up. And the biggest thing that going into the midterms that the Democratic Party does not want is record high inflation, increasing unemployment, completely unaffordable housing, and mortgage rates at 6%. So my personal belief is the Fed is going to hike rates again tomorrow or Wednesday, right? Then what they're going to do is they're going to probably hike Fed funds rates one more time. And then at the end of the year, they're going to have to come out right in about November time and say, hey, The economy has cooled off. We've done our job curbing inflation.
Right.
Let's pause this. And then in March and April, they'll start cutting rates. And that's the way mortgage rates work. And so once they get officially in a recession, in between 6 months and 9 months into the official recession, we always see mortgage interest rates drop by about 30% from their peak. So definitely, I think it's going to be a little bit of pain for 12 to 18 months. But with the average American having a mortgage rate on their home at 3.5%, their payment is a fixed rate payment. It's not like what we had in the crash of 2008, 9, and 10, where 60% of Americans had adjustable loans.
Right.
And so the problem with housing right now is not that people, aren't able to afford their mortgage payment. It's people are not able to afford to move up to the nicer house any longer. So they're sitting comfy at their $1,500 a month mortgage payment when they can't even rent that same house for $2,500 a month. So we're just going to see no buyer demand, but we're also not going to see a flood of listings hit the market because where are they going to go?
Right.
So that's kind of what we're kind of seeing right now.
So with all of that in mind, we're definitely in a recession. It's going to get worse.
Yes.
What do you predict over the next 12 months? And based on what you predict, what do you think our listeners should be doing? What could they do to prepare? How can they set themselves up for success?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I definitely think things are going to get much worse. Now, I don't want you guys to panic because we are not going to go into a Great Depression. We have a lot of backstops that have been put into place since the collapse in the 1930s. And that's what a lot of people don't realize is if you study history, and that's what I do, I love history, is what we saw the roaring 20s with just this insane amount of free stimulus. That was the first time that the average American could invest in publicly traded companies. And we saw this massive crash in the stock market. And what we're going to see right now is a lot of those backstops have been put into place. So what we're going to see is we're going to start seeing unemployment numbers dramatically tick up because we are in an economy that is built 70% on us spending money. Okay. And people are not going to be spending money the same way. We're going to see earnings of these big companies come out. I think we're going to see probably as much as about another 20% could shed in the stock market. I think that things are going to be pretty not fun for the average person. But if you have a mortgage and it's a fixed rate and you have a low payment, stay put. Number two is if you are looking to invest in properties, do not lump sum into anything right now. If somebody has $20,000, $30,000 and like, I don't know where to put this, keep it in the bank, keep it in cash, and slowly dollar cost average in. And what I mean by that is say, okay, I'm going to invest $200 a week, every single week into the stock market or into what I call some recession-proof stocks like Coca-Cola, Dollar General, Little Caesars Pizza. What I always like to tell people is say you're going to go out there and you're going to go to dinner. Well, think about what you would go to dinner if you got a raise, and then think about if you're going to go to dinner and you're going to go with a family member that you know doesn't have a lot of money and you don't want to make them feel uncomfortable. Whatever you would go in that place, those are the companies you need to be investing in because they're going to continue to do well. And so what you have to expect is most people look at how do I try to invest to make money in a recession? And you need to think about the opposite. People's best investment that they could ever make is to create disposable income by eliminating their expenses. And so what I always tell when I meet with families, friends or families, like, Brian, I need to kind of get my finances in order. And even though I'm not a financial planner, I obsess about this kind of stuff, is I tell everybody, it's the bank statement rule. Take your last 3 months of bank statements, print them out, grab a green highlighter, a blue highlighter, and a yellow highlighter. Take your blue highlighter and go through your bank statements and highlight everything that you need to survive on. Your mortgage payment, maybe your single car payment, your medical insurance, your house insurance, your cell phone bill, and highlight all those items. Then take your green highlighter and be like, well, these are things that I'm nice to have, but I got to have groceries, but maybe I don't. I could probably cut these down, but I would really like to not do that at first. Like, maybe the second car, those types of things, and highlight those in green. And then lastly, take a yellow highlighter and highlight every single thing that, I don't want to be gruesome, but like say one of your kids or your spouse got really sick and you needed to pay for medical bills and you had to really, really sharpen your pencil. Highlight everything in yellow that you don't need to survive. And then what you want to do, all those things in yellow, go and cut them out. Because I'm telling everybody, mark my words, that I think over the next 12 months, things are going to get a lot worse in terms of, just people feeling that crunch. Inflation is not going to come down that super fast. There's too much money in the system. Prices are going to take a while to balance out. And then take all those things, add them up in yellow, get that summary amount. And now don't change your patterns. Don't go out there and be like, oh, I just saved $600 a month. Let me go buy a new car. No, take that $600 a month that you just saved, and I want you to set up an auto pay draft into a savings account. Treat it like it's an expense. People they don't treat investing or saving like an expense. It's like, oh, well, if I have enough money left over, then I'll save. No, treat it like your mortgage payment. And remember, if that's going out of your account every month, then you're going to give yourself a nest egg, because I'll be very honest with people. If somebody right now does not have at least 3 to 4 months of an emergency fund, go through your bank statements, get aggressive, cut those things out and get that started, because they are not going to be turning on the stimulus faucet for probably another 12 to 18 months.
That's great advice. I mean, what you're saying is totally biblical. Live within your means, and be a good steward of the resources God has given you. And I think it's something that we as Americans haven't done a good job of. We've created this consumer mentality, and, you look at the generation, our grandparents' generation, that great generation, the greatest generation, and just their attitude towards buying things. You were talking about, financing a mattress or something, like these things that people finance. It's like, look, if you can't afford it, don't buy it.
Yeah. And I went to recently had the opportunity to kind of speak with Tony Robbins. And one of the things I was asking him just kind of backstage, and I talked to him and I said, I have a question for you. You obviously do very, very well. You're worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But when you were growing into that wealth, when did you make the decision to, hey, I'm going to buy this jet, or hey, I'm going to go and invest and buy this hotel, or hey, I'm going to build this lavish home? When did you make that decision that you thought you would be okay financially? And he goes, when I could buy 2 of them. And I thought about it, and I was like, that's a brilliant thing. Like if you can't buy 2 of something, then I'm not saying it for like a house, for example, but if you're going to buy a luxury item, you're going to go buy a sports car, you're going to go buy a brand new mattress, can you afford to buy 2 of them? And if you can't, probably not the right time to be able to buy a luxury item. And in America, we don't think that way. We're like, okay, well, if we don't go on a vacation this year and we cut back and maybe only go out to dinner once a week, okay, we can probably squeeze this boat payment in, right? Right. And it's like people have a boat payment and an RV payment, but they're not even putting any money away from retirement. And yet the average American is now going to live in probably 5 or 6 years. We're not going to live to 72. We're going to probably live to our mid to late 80s. So now we got to have the retirement to live for 30 years after we retire. So how are you going to make that do if you don't even start saving to retirement till 10 years before you retire?
Right.
Right. And it's just, unfortunately, it's the lack of what I know you're a really big proponent of, is educating in public schools, right? We spend all this time teaching CRT and teaching all these random Edgar Allan Poe, but we don't teach kids credit, savings, balancing a checkbook. Why not?
Right. Yeah. These things that are essential to being a good steward of the resources we have. Yeah. You've got your own program. You got a podcast you've got your social media. Yep. How can people follow you and find out more information about what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I try to really put out as much free content as possible on my Instagram channel. It's just at the Brian Decker, with Brian with an I, on there. And then I also do put quite a bit of content out on YouTube. It's just Dollars with Decker is the YouTube. And I try to just do as much free content as possible out there. As obviously being born and raised here, I never really realized the lack of financial IQ that we embed in our individuals, especially as our youth at a young age. So I've kind of just made it, kind of my burning passion. I love to teach and love to do it. And, I just see any way I can ever take a lesson that I've learned from a mentor myself and pass it on. So like I said, I try to make it simple and bite-sized so people can, kind of have some quick wins for their life.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate it. We appreciate what you do. We're going to put all the ways to connect with you into the comment section, and hope people will connect with you and get educated. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for joining us today on the program, and we'll have you back on.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Pastor Tim.
Thank you. And I just want to thank everybody for tuning in today. More coming up in the future. We'll have Brian Decker on again, and I just want to encourage you to pay attention to what's going on in the world right now. Study history. Know, we know this. If you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat it. So let's know what's happened in the past. Let's see the signs of what's happening right now and be good stewards as we move forward. We'll see you next time on Our Watch with Tim Thompson.